The first thing people remember is the sound, not the sight, not the smell, the sound. A thin animal scream tearing through the trees long before dawn, carried downhill by cold Alabama air. It wasn't loud enough to be a cry for help, and it wasn't weak enough to be ignored. It hovered in that impossible space between, a sound that suggested something alive was being broken slowly, deliberately by hands that knew it too well. Those who heard it said it came from the hollow where the Blackwood land began, a place where the forest thickened unnaturally, where the trees grew crooked as if recoiling from the soil itself. Some swore the scream was followed by the wet crack of bone. Others said it dissolved into murmured voices, overlapping, indistinct, as if many mouths were sharing one throat. No one went looking. They never did. By the time the sun rose, the sound was gone. Only the fog remained, clinging low to the ground, wrapping the hills in something that looked less like mist and more like breath. Slow, patient, watching. That land had a way of holding its secrets. Paper rotted faster there. Ink faded. Graves sank into themselves. Even memories seemed to soften at the edges, as if the mountains were grinding them down grain by grain. What survived did so in whispers passed between older mouths, in glances exchanged at church when certain names were mentioned, in the way parents tightened their grip on their children when the road bent too close to that valley. The Blackwoods were never spoken of directly. Not at first. They were referred to sideways, through euphemism and gesture, the people up there, the family on the ridge. Blood turned inward. It was said their house was always warm, even in winter, that the windows were never fully dark, that something inside was always awake. If you're listening to this now, pause for a moment. Which city are you listening from, and what time is it where you are right now? There's something fitting about knowing where this story finds you and how deep into the night, or day, you've allowed it to reach. Long before doctors arrived, before records were written and sealed away, the Blackwoods were already old. Old in the way rot is old. Old in the way a wound becomes part of the body instead of something that heals. Their lineage had folded in on itself so many times that no one could say where one generation ended and another began. Mothers shared faces with daughters. Brothers raised sons who called them uncle and father in the same breath. And somewhere inside that tangle of blood and silence, a child was born who should not have been. They say the midwife left before the cord was cut. They say the child didn't cry right away. They say when it finally did, the scream sounded exactly like the one that still echoes through the trees when the wind is right. The hills kept listening, and the story was only beginning. The valley where the Blackwoods settled did not appear on most maps. It existed in the margins, in the pale creases where surveyors had lifted their pens and decided there was nothing worth recording. Winston County held many such places, folds of land pressed together by time and neglect, but this one seemed determined to remain unmarked. The road that led there narrowed without warning. Gravel surrendered to dirt, dirt to exposed stone. Trees leaned inward, as if listening, their roots clawing at the red clay like fingers that refused to let go. By the time a traveler realized they had gone too far, turning back felt like trespass. The first Blackwood arrived in that hollow sometime around the end of the 19th century. No one agreed on the exact year. Records from neighboring counties showed gaps, torn pages, names scratched out and rewritten in different hands. What remained suggested a man fleeing something unnamed, carrying his family into the hills with the urgency of someone who believed distance alone could erase sin. The land accepted him. Isolation was not an accident, it was cultivated. The Blackwoods built their houses close together but far from everyone else, as if the world beyond the trees carried a disease more dangerous than hunger or cold. They grew their own food, buried their own dead, taught their children only what could be learned without books. Births were marked with chalk on a beam inside the main house. Deaths were sometimes marked, sometimes not. Church bells rang miles away, but the sound never reached. The hollow. By the time the 20th century arrived, the family had already begun to fold inward. Marriages took place without witnesses. Names repeated themselves until they lost meaning. A daughter named for her mother would later give birth to a child bearing the same name, and the difference between them existed only in wrinkles and posture. Outsiders who glimpsed them at a distance struggled to count how many there were. Faces blurred together, gaits mirrored one another, Even their voices carried the same flattened tone, as if shaped by a single mouth passed down through generations. It was during this period that the stories of the children began. A boy who did not speak until nearly 10, then suddenly recited entire conversations he should never have heard. A girl whose limbs bent at angles that made neighbors avert their eyes, yet who could run through the woods faster than anyone else. Infants born with too many fingers, or too few, their hands wrapped quickly and kept hidden from the light. The mountains learned their cries early. One winter, a trapper passing too close to the property reported seeing a child standing barefoot in the snow, staring at him without blinking. The child did not wave, did not flinch, only watched, head tilted slightly, as if studying a shape it planned to remember later. When the trapper looked away to steady his mule and looked back again, the child was gone. No footprints marked the ground. By the 1920s, the Blackwoods were no longer just isolated. They were avoided. People in town spoke of sickness without contagion, of blood that carried its own punishment. They said the family tree had collapsed inward, roots strangling roots, branches grafted back into the trunk. They said whatever was being born up there was not meant to survive long in the open world, and yet it did. Somewhere inside that house, beneath beams marked with decades of chalk, a child was growing, a child who listened more than spoke, a child whose body carried the quiet evidence of too much sameness, a child the hills seemed to recognize. The child was small at birth, light enough that the woman who delivered him believed, for a moment, he was already dead. His skin carried a grayish pallor, stretched tight over fragile bones, his head slightly misshapen, as if the skull itself had hesitated before closing. When he finally drew breath, it came in shallow, rattling pulls, each one sounding borrowed rather than owned. They named him Samuel. No record marked the day, no Bible inscription, only a faint line of chalk added to the beam above the hearth, squeezed between older names written in hands long turned to dust. The woman who bore him was both sister and wife to the man who claimed him. No one in the house questioned this. By then, such pairings had lost their ability to shock. Blood had become a closed system, recycling itself until distinctions no longer mattered. Samuel did not cry often. When he did, it was brief and unsettling, a sound too controlled for an infant. He spent long hours staring upward, eyes tracking things no one else could see. Sometimes his gaze followed the slow swing of the oil lamp. Sometimes it lingered on empty corners where the light failed to reach. As he grew, his body revealed the cost of the lineage that shaped him. His fingers were thick and slightly fused, joints stiff and resistant. One leg dragged subtly behind the other, forcing him into a halting, uneven walk. His face bore a softness that never sharpened with age, features blurred, as if pressed too many times from the same mold. Yet there was something else. Samuel listened. While other children learned chores, he learned patterns. The creak of floorboards that preceded certain footsteps, the rhythm of breath in sleeping bodies, the way voices changed when speaking truth versus concealment. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words arrived fully formed, unsettling in their precision. At night, he drew. Charcoal scavenged from the hearth left marks on scraps of wood and torn cloth. He sketched spirals, interlocking shapes, crude figures bent backward at impossible angles. Sometimes he drew trees with roots tangled into knots that resembled human hands. Sometimes he drew faces, dozens of them, stacked atop one another, eyes repeating endlessly, mouths shared between generations. His mother burned most of these drawings without comment. The smell of scorched charcoal became a familiar part of the hall, mingling with the ever-present scent of damp wood and unwashed bodies. Neighbors who caught glimpses of Samuel whispered that he seemed older than his years, that he moved like someone remembering a body rather than inhabiting one. When asked his age, he would pause, frown slightly, and give answers that did not align with the calendar. Sometimes he named years that belonged to the dead. Animals avoided him. Dogs that strayed near the property would whine and retreat, tails tucked low. Chickens stopped laying eggs in corners where Samuel lingered too long. Once, a goat was found dead near the tree line, its neck twisted sharply, eyes clouded over. No one claimed responsibility. No one asked Samuel where he had been that morning. Inside the house, the older generation watched him with a mix of pride and unease. They spoke of him as proof of endurance, of blood preserved against dilution. But in their silence lived another thought, unspoken yet heavy. Something in Samuel was carrying more than one lifetime, and it was learning. As Samuel grew, the nights around the Blackwood property changed. Sounds that once belonged to the forest began to feel deliberate. Branches snapped in slow, measured intervals. Owls called out of season, their cries echoing too close to the house. There were evenings when the wind died completely, leaving the hollow sealed in a suffocating stillness broken only by movement from within the walls. It was during these nights that the family began their gatherings. No one called them rituals. They were simply the evenings. Lamps were dimmed. Windows were covered with old blankets stiff with age. The family gathered in the largest room, forming a loose circle that shifted each time as bodies pressed together, some sitting, some standing, some leaning heavily against the walls as if the house itself were the only thing holding them upright. Samuel always sat at the center. He was not placed there. He drifted there naturally, as if gravity favored him. By then his speech had grown stranger. He spoke in fragments, phrases borrowed from older mouths, intonations that mimicked voices long gone. Sometimes he corrected adults on stories they believed they remembered accurately. Sometimes he finished their sentences before they realized they had begun speaking. Marks began appearing on the floor. At first they were dismissed as scratches from boots or furniture dragged too often across warped boards. But the shapes repeated. Circles within circles, lines intersecting at uneven angles. Symbols no one could recall teaching Samuel, yet which he traced obsessively with his finger, over and over, until the skin at his fingertips split and bled. On certain nights the family sang, not hymns, not songs with words anyone recognized, low, droning tones that rose and fell together, breaths synchronized as if guided by an unseen conductor. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, into the foundations, down into the soil. Samuel hummed with them, eyes closed, his head rocking slightly, his body swaying in time with something beyond the room. Neighbors reported screams during these evenings, not constant, isolated, short bursts of sound cut off abruptly, as if the source had been smothered. Once, a passerby claimed to see figures moving between the trees behind the house, lantern light flashing briefly before vanishing. Inside, confusion began to spread. Children struggled to name their parents correctly. A boy called his mother aunt, and then grandmother in the same breath. An older woman, frail and bent, insisted Samuel had been present at her own birth. She spoke the claim calmly, without irony, as though stating a simple fact. The family tree, once difficult to follow, collapsed entirely. Relationships overlapped until language failed. The same man appeared in multiple roles depending on who was speaking. Time itself seemed to fold, past and present layering atop one another like sediment. Samuel's drawings grew more detailed. He began sketching the house from above, mapping rooms he had never entered, marking spaces beneath floorboards where bones had been hidden. He drew people with faces split down the middle, one side young, the other aged beyond recognition. In the margins, he added dates that predated his birth by decades. Dead animals became more common. Rabbits laid out carefully near the tree line, their bodies arranged with disturbing symmetry. Birds with their wings backward, beaks stuffed with bits of twine or hair. Each time the family disposed of the remains without discussion, burying them shallowly, as if offering them back to the land. By the time Samuel turned 12, at least according to the chalk marks, no one in the house could remember a time before him. He moved among them like an echo given flesh, and whatever had begun as isolation was transforming into something else entirely, something sealed. The truth did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, like damp through old wood, until every surface carried its stain. It began with a birth that went wrong. Samuel was nearly 13 when one of the younger women went into labor in the back room. Her screams carried through the house, sharp and unfiltered, each cry pulling something loose in the air. The older women moved with practiced efficiency, hands steady, faces blank. They had done this too many times to fear it anymore. The child emerged twisted and silent. Extra fingers curled uselessly against a chest that barely rose. The head was too small, the jaw underformed, the eyes clouded as if already turning inward. When the body finally stilled, no one wept. They wrapped it in cloth and set it aside, waiting for dawn. Samuel watched the entire process. Later, when asked whose child it had been, answers conflicted. One woman claimed the father was her husband. Another corrected her, naming a brother instead. A third insisted the man in question was already dead when the child was conceived. Voices overlapped, arguments tangled, and for the first time, panic edged into the room. Samuel spoke. "She was born from herself," he said quietly. Silence followed. He stood and walked to the beam above the hearth, the one thick with chalk marks. With a piece of charcoal, he began drawing lines between names. Not a tree, a knot. Mothers connected back to their own fathers, sisters looping into wives, sons doubling as uncles. The lines crossed and recrossed until the page beneath was nearly black. "This is how it works," Samuel continued. "It always comes back." That night, the family spoke openly for the first time. What had once been justified as necessity was named for what it was. Fathers taking daughters, brothers sharing sisters, children raised inside a closed circle where no new blood ever entered. What began as isolation hardened into doctrine. Outsiders were corruption. Purity required sameness, and sameness demanded sacrifice. The child Samuel was not an accident. He was the result of a union repeated across generations, a deliberate tightening of the circle. His mother had been bred from within the deepest part of the family knot. His father carried the same blood from two sides of the tree. They had believed this would produce strength, continuity, a lineage untouched. Instead, it produced him. The realization fractured what little order remained. Some family members recoiled, horror dawning too late. Others clung radia to tradition, insisting this knowledge changed nothing. They had lived this way their entire lives. To reject it now would mean admitting every birth, every death had been wrong. Samuel listened as they argued. "You're afraid because you can see it now," he said. "But it's been this way longer than any of you remember." One woman began to sob, clawing at her face as if trying to peel away her own skin. Another whispered prayers that tangled and broke apart before they reached any god that might have been listening. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, whipping through the hollow, rattling the house as if something beneath the ground had shifted. The family tree had folded in on itself completely, and it was starting to rot from the center outward. The town felt it before it understood it. Word traveled in fragments, half-heard confessions, a doctor's silence, a preacher's sudden interest in a place he had avoided for decades. People spoke in lowered voices about what had been discovered, though no one could say precisely how they knew. It was as if the knowledge itself leaked out of the hollow, riding the wind, settling into conversations like ash. Fear followed quickly. Children were pulled indoors earlier. Livestock pens were reinforced. A group of men began meeting after church, their faces tight, their prayers short and practical. They spoke of sin not as an abstract failing, but as something that spread when ignored. When they finally went to the Blackwood property, they did not go alone. The first fire was accidental, at least officially. A lantern tipped, a barn caught. Flames climbed dry wood with unnatural speed, lighting the trees in a flickering orange glow that could be seen from town. By the time the men arrived, fire had already taken hold of the outbuildings. No one tried. Very hard to stop it. Animals screamed as the flames closed in. Pigs broke free and ran, their skin blistering, their cries piercing the night. Chickens burned in place, wings beating uselessly against wire. The smell was thick and unforgettable. Inside the house, chaos reigned. Some family members fled into the woods, disappearing between the trees without shoes or coats. Others refused to leave, clutching furniture, walls, each other. Samuel stood at the doorway, watching the fire advance, his face calm, almost curious. "They're erasing us," someone shouted. "No," Samuel replied. "They're trying." The church arrived next, not with hymns, but with ledgers. Old baptismal records were gathered, marriage entries scrutinized, pages were torn out, names scratched away, entire sections burned behind the rectory. The preacher spoke of mercy while his hands shook, ash smearing his cuffs, This was not justice, it was containment. The town could not allow the Blackwoods to exist as they were. Their presence challenged something fundamental, something people preferred to believe belonged only to distant histories and foreign places. The solution was destruction, followed by silence. By morning, the main house still stood, blackened but intact. Smoke drifted upward in thin, exhausted streams. Bodies were counted, but not carefully. Some were never found. It was easier to assume they had fled, or perished unseen. Samuel was taken. Not arrested, not rescued, removed. A doctor's car carried him away under the pretense of evaluation. The family did not protest. Some watched with relief, others with a grief too complicated to name. The hollow grew quiet after that. Grass crept back over scorched earth. Charred beams were pulled down and buried. The road narrowed again, reclaiming its anonymity. Officially, the Blackwoods ceased to exist, but the damage lingered. Children in town were born with subtle abnormalities in the years that followed. Cleft palates, vision problems, learning difficulties no one could explain. Mothers whispered fears into pillows. Fathers drank more heavily. The preacher preached louder. They had tried to burn the knowledge away. They did not succeed. The records resurfaced in the late 1980s, long after the land had been sold, resold and stripped of anything that resembled memory. They were not found in an archive or a courthouse. They surfaced in a cardboard box left beneath a staircase in a county hospital scheduled for demolition. Water-stained folders, curling photographs, cassette tapes labeled only with dates and a single initial. J.H. The researcher who opened the box had not been looking for the Blackwoods. He was tracing rural health anomalies, patterns of congenital illness that seemed to cluster in places no longer spoken of. The name appeared first in a margin, handwritten, then again on a photograph's reverse, pressed so hard it had bled through the paper. The images were difficult to look at. Faces blur, red by age and poor focus, yet unmistakably similar. Eyes set too far apart, jaws pulled inward, limbs bent in subtle, repeated ways. One photograph showed a boy standing barefoot in dirt, his head tilted, his expression unreadable. On the back, a single word, Samuel. The tapes were worse. Voices recorded in low tones, interrupted by static and long pauses. A doctor, describing unprecedented levels of genetic overlap. A woman whispering that she had given birth to her own nephew. A child humming softly in the background, the sound stretching unnaturally, bending around the edges of speech. One tape ended abruptly with the sound of fire. As the researcher followed the thread, he found corroboration in places that should not have connected. Church ledgers with pages removed, census data listing households that vanished between decades, medical files sealed for reasons that no longer made sense. Each absence pointed to something deliberately hidden. He visited the land. Nothing remained but a shallow depression where the main house once stood. Trees had grown unevenly, their trunks twisted, bark split as if under internal strain. The ground felt wrong beneath his feet, too soft in places, compacted in others. Metal fragments surfaced after rain, bent nails, a rusted hinge. He recorded his impressions on tape. There's a sense of repetition here, he said, as if the ground remembers. Locals refused to speak at first. Then, gradually, fragments emerged. A scream heard decades ago. A fire no one admitted starting. A boy who knew things he shouldn't. Each story contradicted the next in detail, but not in feeling. The same unease threaded through all of them. The researcher traced Samuel's fate next. Institutional records showed a boy admitted under a different name, age approximate, diagnosis vague, severe congenital abnormalities, advanced cognitive development in narrow domains, episodes of dissociation. Notes in the margin mentioned his habit of correcting staff about their own histories. He was transferred twice. Then the record stopped. No death certificate, no discharge, just an empty line where a life should have concluded. The researcher listened to the last tape again that night. Beneath the static, beneath the doctor's voice, the humming returned. Slower this time, almost rhythmic, almost deliberate, and for the first time he wondered whether the Blackwoods story had truly ended, or whether it had simply learned how to hide. In the early 1990s, the researcher returned to the case one last time, drawn back by a detail he had initially dismissed as coincidence. Hospital staff who had worked the night shifts during Samuel's confinement had reported similar dreams. Not shared stories, shared experiences, long corridors that bent inward, rooms that repeated endlessly. A child's humming echoing from behind locked doors, always just out of sight. Those who dreamed it woke with headaches, nosebleeds, a lingering sense that something had followed them back into waking life. One nurse, interviewed years later, described recognizing Samuel's voice before remembering his face. "He knew my name," she said, "not the one on my badge. The one my mother almost gave me. The institution where Samuel had last been recorded burned in 1979. Electrical fire, total loss of records, no fatalities officially reported. The building was cleared, the land repurposed, the incident folded neatly into municipal history, but the patterns did not stop." The researcher mapped birth defects across northern Alabama, then outward. Subtle traits, recessive conditions resurfacing in families with no apparent history. Children born with hands that mirrored Samuel's drawings. Adults with inexplicable familiarity toward places they had never visited. Blood remembers. In one particularly unsettling discovery, the researcher found that several descendants of families once living near the Blackwood Hollow shared genetic markers with no clear origin. The trail suggested dispersal, not extinction, as if fragments of the lineage had escaped the fire, diluted but persistent, carried unknowingly into the wider population. The tapes ended with a final recording, dated but unlabeled. The voice was older, weaker. The same doctor from the earlier tapes, speaking alone. "We thought isolation was the disease," he said, "but it was only the condition that allowed it to grow. What we witnessed was not just inbreeding, it was recursion. The same blood folding back on itself until it forgot where it began." There was a pause. "I don't believe the boy was the result," the voice continued. "I believe he was the mechanism." The tape ended without explanation. The researcher never published his full findings. Portions appeared in obscure journals, others remained in private notes. When asked why, he cited ethical uncertainty, but those close to him noticed changes. He began tracing his own family tree obsessively, asked uncomfortable questions at reunions, listened too closely to the way his relatives spoke. In his final interview, he said only this: "Some stories don't end. They migrate. The land where the Blackwood house once stood remains unmarked. No plaque, no warning. Just trees growing slightly wrong, their roots tangled beneath the soil, holding fast to something that refuses to be forgotten. And sometimes, when the wind cuts just right through the hollow, people still hear humming. If you had grown up there, you might have called it normal. That is the most unsettling truth the Blackwoods left behind. Not the deformities, not the incest, not even the fires meant to erase them. Normal is what happens when a boundary is crossed often enough that it disappears. The family did not believe they were doing wrong. They believed they were preserving something: blood, land, identity. Over time, those beliefs hardened into law, and law into instinct. Children learned who they were allowed to love before the learned to read. Bodies became vessels for repetition. Each generation inherited not only traits but obligations. By the time anyone tried to intervene, the damage was no longer confined to the flesh. It had sunk into memory, into language, into the way the family understood itself. And perhaps that is why the story refuses to stay buried, because it forces a question that has no clean answer. At what point does tradition become harm? When does autonomy collapse into neglect? How many generations does it take before a choice is no longer a choice at all? Somewhere, records still exist bearing different names, but familiar patterns. Somewhere, a child is being born into a family that believes isolation is safety, that sameness is purity, that the outside world is the threat. Somewhere, blood is folding inward again, quietly, patiently. And if you were to uncover it, if you were to find proof that your own lineage carried such a secret, what would you do? What would you do if you learned your mother was also your sister? Would you burn the records and call it mercy? Would you expose the truth and accept what follows? Or would you do what so many before you have done? Close the door, lower your voice, and let the hills keep listening. The mountains have never judged, they only remember, and they are very good at waiting. If you listen closely to stories like this, you begin to notice what they are really about. Not deformity, not spectacle, not even incest itself. They are about permission. The Blackwoods did not wake one morning and decide to destroy themselves. Their collapse was quieter than that. It arrived wrapped in justification, in fear of outsiders, in the belief that survival required closing ranks. Each generation gave the next permission to go a little further, to narrow the circle a little more, to excuse what once would have been unthinkable. By the time Samuel was born, the boundary between protection and violation no longer existed. Blood had become law had become instinct. Children were not taught alternatives, because alternatives had been erased before they were born. That is why the fires failed. You can burn houses, you can tear pages from ledgers, you can seal files and rename patients and pretend a family never existed, but you cannot erase what has already been carried forward inside living bodies. You cannot cauterize memory once it has been inherited. Somewhere beyond that hollow, descendants walk among others unnoticed. Their names are different, their faces less marked, but the past has not vanished, only thinned, stretched across time, waiting for the right conditions to surface again. The Blackwoods were not an ending, they were a warning written too late. A reminder that isolation does not protect innocence. It incubates decay, that secrecy does not preserve purity, it concentrates harm, and that when a family decides the world is its enemy, the children are always the ones who pay the price. So consider this carefully. If you uncovered a box of records beneath a staircase, if you heard a tape that should not exist, if you traced your own bloodline and found it folding back on itself, name over name, generation after generation, what would you do? Would you speak, knowing the truth might destroy what remains of your family? Or would you choose silence and become another quiet link in a chain that has already claimed too many? The mountains never answered that question. They only watched, and they are still watching now.